4 days after his conviction, former South African President Jacob Zuma, his supporters are still out there chanting, asking that a whole lot be reversed. But there's one thing that Africans are excited about, and it is South Africa setting the pace for an unprecedented, ruling, which means democracy has actually come to stay on the continent. That's our focus today on Village Square Africa. Welcome, I'm Sulai. I call it never before seen, but it's happening, and it is happening in South Africa. Jacob Zuma is one of South Africa's foremost anti-apartheid fighters, an important element of the South African story since the 1960s, and one whose name is often greeted with mixed reactions. With litanies of corruption allegations in his name and most recently getting involved in political battles, 79-year-old Zuma is a man that's always in the news. Last week, Zuma was jailed for failing to appear before a commission seeking to ask him questions on some corruption allegations. While he fights to stay out of jail at South Africa's highest court, the Constitutional Court, his supporters have gone on a terrible spree of destruction of lives and properties, with police on Monday recording 6 fatalities. Now, that's not nice. The fear in locals is palpable, and the decision that is made about Zuma will be key to the peace South Africa urgently desires. Now, old friends have become new foes, and it's a power tussle moved and championed by the many locals who always are at the receiving end. Joining me today from South Africa to discuss this, Matodzi Ratshimbilani, a lawyer and director at TGR Attorneys in Johannesburg, and Sanusha Naidoo is a political analyst and senior researcher associate based with the Institute for Global Dialogue, Cape Town. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome to Village Square Africa. Very quickly, let me start with you, Sanusha. The good thing is that I'm excited because both of you have had, cause to have this conversation with me on the news, and it's good a thing we are stretching this. What should we start from looking at? Let's help, establish this for many Africans who don't know the genesis of what we're dealing with at the moment. Help us, take us through how it all started for Jacob Zuma being in jail.
Good evening, Suleiman. Good evening to my colleague. And it's always a pleasure to be on a show with you. I think I've always enjoyed our discussion. So where did this all begin? I think this begins way, way back. It goes back to the arms deal crisis of 2005, where Mr. Jacob Zuma was implicated in an arms deal involving a French arms company called Travails. And that there was, the way the arms deal crisis unfolded was that Mr. Jacob Zuma had received a bribe of 500,000 rand. At the time, I think it was quite negligible in international currency terms. And so on the basis of that, the president at the time of South Africa, President Thabo Mbeki, investigated this. He instituted an investigation to say, this must be investigated. And then, of course, there was the arms deal. And that arms deal involved one of Mr. Jacob Zuma's very close associates, Mr. Schabir Shaik. And it seemed to be that through Mr. Schabir Shaik's companies, Kobe Investments and others, that this relationship with Travails had become part and parcel of the way in which the transactional value for this arms deal to take place. In other words, a bribe was placed forward, and of course the idea was that the French company would get the tender, and it all kind of transacted through Mr. Schabir Shaik's company, which was called Kobe Holdings and Kobe Investments. When the court case came, the evidence against Mr. Jacob Zuma was a bit more lighter, and I'm sure my colleague, the legal expert, will give you more than I could. And so it was Mr. Schabir Shaik who had to face a lot of the legal dimensions around this. And it turned out to be that Mr. Schabir Shaik, in his court appearance, the judge found that whilst there may have been an essentially corrupt relationship between Mr. Schabir Shaik and Mr. Jacob Zuma, the intention or the court could not find it to become an overwhelming one. So that was strike one, where Mr. Jacob Zuma on the arms deal essentially got off because there wasn't sufficient evidence to charge him or to take litigation further. And this did not bode well for Mr. Shabir Sheikh, because Mr. Shabir Sheikh had to serve a period of time in terms of what his role is in this whole thing. And so he ended up serving some time. And of course, he claimed that he was medically sick, and so he got medically paroled. And the very next day, he was on a golf course playing his game of golf. But that's a different issue. Then, of course, there was the whole question around corruption charges that were linked to a tape that became the infamous tape of what we now know as the 783 corruption charges. That tape essentially dealt with a whole lot of other issues with regard to corruption again. And so we come back to this whole question of President Jacob Zuma and the corruption charges. But then, of course, the prosecutor at the time essentially decided that they couldn't go forward with this thing because it was compromised. They couldn't find the evidence, or they couldn't place the evidence in a way that didn't come across as being compromised. And so the prosecuting authority at the time decided that they're going to squash this. And he said that this was a politically motivated approach, and therefore those 700 plus charges should actually be dropped. And the whole Jacob Zuma issue then kind of fell away. Now, where we are today is that we're coming back to not necessarily those charges, but we're coming to the point of what was Mr. Jacob Zuma's role in regard to state capture under the Zondo Commission. And in terms of that, was he an enabler of the state capture, an enabler of tender fraud and so forth, involving himself, his family members, as well as this infamous Gupta family, who seem to have held a very, very broad reins around deciding who would be ministers, deciding who would get what portfolio, and deciding, how they would get it and in what capacity they would get these government jobs. Now, in that period, Mr. Jacob Zuma, as President of the Republic, seemed to have developed a very close relationship. His family members, in particular a son or two, had very close association with the Guptas, and there are a number of different associates that have played a critical role in terms of their relationship to the Guptas. Okay. What is important for me to just make as a last point is the money that was coming out that ended up, the catalyst for all of this, Suleiman, was the upgrade to Mr. Zuma's home in Nkandla, KZN, which, as the Public Protector report called it, living in comfort. And that was the beginning of where we see ourselves today.
Thank you very much, Sanusha. And Matodzi, let's look at the legal framework, because Sanusha also said that. She said, well, let's concede that to you because you're the legal mind here. From the legal perspective on this issue, Jacob Zuma's legal representative, Dali Mpofu, said at the Concord today that the court may have exceeded the bounds of the Constitution in its judgment. Well, I recall some perspective you shared with me then. Do you agree with Mpofu first to start with?
Look, I think there's a lot that's being said, and there's a lot of what sometimes may sound like compelling arguments. But I think the problem with Mr. Mpofu's argument is that what he's arguing comes across as an appeal. So he says, look, the Constitutional found this way. They did not accept that the approach, because you cannot appeal a constitutional court decision, which is our apex court. He went there under the pretext of what is called a rescission of judgment. And that's a narrow procedure intended for instances where there are errors, where there are mistaken decisions made by the court. And I think that's his biggest challenge. So, it might very well be, there's counter arguments that Mr. Zuma had plenty of time to come and raise all concerns that he may have. But the case that we're currently looking at, in my humble view, he has not made enough argument to say why the decision should be rescinded. He seems to be making an appeal, which which has a technical nuance and a big difference.
Well, I'll stay with you, Matodzi, before we go back to Sanusha, because it will mean that the Constitutional Court is almost equivalent, or is equivalent to what in Nigeria have in the Supreme Court. Now, many Africans, especially in the west of the continent, have been looking at South Africa, and they say, yes, quite frankly, a younger democracy compared to others, but it seems that South Africa is showing the way when it means the rule of what it means by the rule of law. Zuma is one man. That means a lot of things to different South Africans, Matodzi. But are the protests and lootings really driven by the law for him or the current displeasures with the government?
Look, I think maybe Sanusha is more qualified to answer that, but I can venture an opinion here that it's moving at a very fast pace. It started about 2-3 days ago. People are stealing all sorts of things from the images that we see in social media, and I think just as a bystander, I'm convinced that it's more than conscientious beliefs. They're just criminal elements who are stealing anything from coffins and and even sex toys. So it's been. I'm convinced that it might have started as a political matter, but it's currently clearly there's criminal element involved.
Yeah, anyway, we'll come back to you so that we can actually stretch and look at the corruption cases. I get a sense of where we headed. But again, Sanusha, listening to Matodzi and also looking at some of the footages we've seen in South Africa, it would mean just one thing, and a lot of people aren't too excited that South Africa is getting into what they call, some mess, politically speaking. Now, how does this happen when a court, of competent jurisdiction, the highest court in the land, pronounces a judgment? Because this is almost happening for the very first time in South Africa. It's unprecedented. Do you think this may ultimately jeopardize or set a bad precedent as it is now in South Africa going forward?
Well, I think, Suleiman, the first point is how did we get here? And we got here because there was a court ruling on the 29th of June, which ruled that Mr. Jacob Zuma had essentially defied a court order for him to appear before the Zondo Commission. The Zondo Commission is essentially a commission of inquiry set up by the previous public protector to investigate state capture, to investigate elements of irregular state funding, money that was supposed to be put for contracts, etc., and how it has been irregularly accessed and so forth. So this, and it starts off with this report that the previous public protector, Thuli Madonsela, wrote called Living in Comfort. And in there, she found a lot of excesses, but a lot of contradictions around how money was used to build the president's residence, which is now in Nkandla, and how much of that money was actually put into this residence and then called a national key point. So on the basis of that, there was a commission of inquiry, which in that report, the former public protector recommended that the president at the time, Jacob Zuma, not be the person to identify who would be the justice or the commissioner to oversee that commission, but rather for the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court to name that individual. Hence, we fast forward and we come to this commission, which was instituted under just Jacob Zuma's presidency. And we have Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Now, the problem here is that President Ramaphosa he appeared before the Zondo Commission, but he didn't like the answers that were given. He didn't like the answers that were questions that were asked. He didn't like way he was being asked, and he started to raise particular specters. He started to say, well, he feels that certain things at the commission were being done in a way to discredit him. Then he went on to say that he objects to the way certain of the lead prosecutors, are asking questions. Then he went on to say he has a serious issue in terms of the Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, because he says there's a conflict of interest. There's some kind of family connection, and he feels that Justice Zondo would be prejudiced towards him. Now, all of these things became part of the playbook that Mr. Zuma had in order to say, I will present myself to the commission, but I don't feel I need to answer certain questions. And if I don't want to be here, I can just raise all these questions. And so Mr. Zuma's playbook started to get a little bit less strategic and a little bit more clumsy. And at the end of the day, what you had was when he was supposed to have appeared before the Zondo Commission, he essentially came in and then his lawyer said, we are leaving. And that was a contempt. And so what Justice Zondo did was went to the Constitutional Court and said, this is a contempt. He hasn't necessarily even come back to the court. And then they said, there was a warrant for him to come back. He didn't even abide to that. So they went to the Constitutional Court and they said, well, this is what we are dealing with. What action? So the Constitutional Court said, okay, in the judgment read by Justice Kampepe, she called him a person who is unreliable, so to speak. She basically took a very critical view of his character and said Mr. Zuma would not do what we want him to do. He has constantly erred the judicial system, and he's constantly ignored the judicial system, and he's constantly undermined the judicial system. So at the end of the day, they said a 15-month jail term for contempt of court. This is where we are now, and this is what we're seeing in terms of these protests.
Okay, let me bring Matodzi here, because it would seem as if some people, your colleagues, lawyers, didn't help Mr. Zuma in this case. Some have argued to say that they knew where this was headed if Mr. Zuma continued, in that line of action that have ultimately put him where he is today. If you were to have a very difficult or uncooperative, client, what should a lawyer do in this case?
It's a tough call. I think maybe before I answer that, just to maybe slightly go back to what Sanusha was talking about for context. The idea that President Jacob Zuma appointed Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, just contextually from a legal point of view, commissions are specifically a prerogative of the president in terms of our constitution. Now, former public protector Thuli Madonsela had an awkward situation where the report that she had prepared, and I think that was the eventual one, the state of capture one, was directly pointing to the president. And then she had to come around with these mechanics where the identity of the commissioner will have to be appointed by the Chief Justice. But on paper and for all intents and purposes, Raymond Zondo was appointed under his signature, and he does, this one of the criticisms that he faces, that if he were genuine about the fact that there were conflicts of interest, he had all the opportunity to raise them then. When he appointed him, he had all the opportunity to raise the objections, over the 3-year period that the commission was running before he appeared. But going to your later question on whether or not, what does one do, if a client refuses advice, I think I'll just start by saying, it actually came up in the arguments of Advocate Mpofu today. They now denounce that it's not in their court papers. There were many reasons why they're claiming he didn't have money, and he believed, that the court will make a good decision on its own. And the idea that the lawyers had ill-advised him seemed to be now abandoned. But as a matter of principle, in legal practice, we are, as lawyers, we are advisors. I give you my advice. It's still up to the client to take it or reject it. So the truth is, we will actually never know exactly what Mr. Zuma's lawyers advised him, because all of that is privileged. What we know is the resulting conduct that we saw. He decided not to participate. For all we know, it might be that they advised him against it, and he decided to act against it. But all of that, will never come to the public, to the public forum.
Matodzi is really, strange, because it's simple logic to a lot of people, knowing full well that if A, then B, and they knew where it was headed, knowing full well that if he continued, he was just, perhaps maybe Jacob Zuma is the best man to let us in on what his thinking or his thoughts were. He thought maybe this wasn't the South Africa that everyone knew, and perhaps he was going to get out of this. But quickly here, Matodzi, There are arguments that Zuma, looking at his age, how we look at, the aged people on the continent, we reference them, the kind of respect. Some thought that he could have gotten a suspended sentence instead. So what does the law say about this for Jacob Zuma? If he were to be in the west of Africa, they would have been calling him Baba. So there's all that math.
We do the same, yeah.
Oh, good. So we're all the same. So people felt that he should have been given a suspended sentence.
Yeah, look, sentencing, it's really a discretion of the court, and in this case, it's not a kind of offense where there are minimum prescribed sentences. But the difficulty that Mr. Zuma has is that, as you may know, at some point in the proceedings, notwithstanding the fact that he had elected not to participate in the proceedings, the commission sent him correspondence to invite him to say, if we were to find you guilty, do you have anything to say in mitigation? And in fact, as the advocates refer to his correspondence, he says he's reconciled himself with going to jail. So pretty much saying that the Constitutional Court can do whatever it deems fit. It is a pity, I think, from a legal point of view, that he elected not to contest this, because the Constitutional Court was faced with a one-sided argument, from the lawyers of the Commission and Justice Zondo. He did not have that opportunity, or at least he did not exercise the opportunity. He was offered the opportunity. So the truth is, we actually will never know. As the advocate of the Commission was saying this morning, his personal circumstances insofar as the sentence is concerned, although everybody knows how old he is because he's a public figure, it's not formally before the court. So one of the arguments they bring, his age, at least it's a public knowledge. There's also a suggestion that he has comorbidities, that are detrimental for the purpose of COVID. But that is said generally and only in oral argument, and no such evidence has been presented to the Constitutional Court. So I think it finds itself in a very difficult position. We may assume that a man of his age has some age-related ailments, but the truth is, because he elected not to participate, that evidence is not formally before court. And I think the Constitutional Court has a tough task before them.
Sanusha, I try as much as possible, to look at what the larger, continent is already thinking. Here in Nigeria, and also even in Ghana, my conversation with some, they are happy that South Africa, the judicial system in South Africa, is actually showing the light. In Nigeria, even for those who have immunity when they leave office, they don't even get close to getting, close to the court, let alone getting a sentence. And everyone is saying, wait a minute, what can we learn from South Africa? But away from that, do you think the protest and, the agitations by his kinsmen haven't actually robbed off the gains, that South Africa has actually given the continent through the judicial, pronouncement?
I think the first thing here is the Constitution and the Constitutional Court. I think up until Wednesday evening last week, the idea was whether or not the Constitution ruling and the Constitutional Court and the Constitution itself will prevail. In other words, the rule of law applies to everybody, irrespective of who you are, based on race, class, gender, color of your skin, and so forth. And up until that point, when we heard the judgment made on the 29th of June and read out by the Chief Justice Kempepe, the majority ruling I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the minority ruling. The majority ruling was very clear. But I think what you picked up from that statement was a sense of frustration as well, because there are so many times that Jacob Zuma comes to the court. There's a sense that he's going to abide by certain rules, and then he tries to find a loophole and get away from it. Now, this time around, if you listen to the justice's reading of the majority rule, it was very hard-hitting. It was hard-hitting, not only on the fact that, Mr. Jacob Zuma had maybe taken the judicial system and trivialized it, but also hard-hitting on the character of Mr. Jacob Zuma as a person. And the argument was that as much as we can implore him to do this, to appear before the Zondo Commission, to make sure that he doesn't necessarily disregard an order that we are putting out, they were trying to say that they had no certainty that he would abide by these things. He would actually, allow for the process and then apply the process. And I'm not saying that the 15-month sentence for contempt of court is what should have been given to him, because from my understanding, and a very limited understanding of law, I think a suspended sentence and maybe a fine was what most people would get in terms of the contempt of court. But I think in this case, they gave him a few times to come in and present, and he didn't really take up the opportunity. Coming back from that space, what does this mean? For me, it means that there's a separation of power. There's the idea that the judiciary system prevails. And most importantly, the person who is actually the one that has to now go and serve the order itself, carry out the order and what the order says, does so because they believe and they trust and they understand that this system or this institution is the highest institution in the land, and therefore I will do that. Up until Wednesday evening, the perception for me, and just maybe my friends and colleagues, was that Mr. Jacob Zuma was going to do the right thing. And we were very naive to believe that, because come the weekend, Mr. Jacob Zuma had then decided he's not doing the right thing. He's not going to present himself to a correctional facility. He's going to try and find a way to get out of this thing. And that's where the messy affair became very, very destructive. There was a party outside his house in Kanjla. People were just strolling and mulling around. There was drink in the air. We had lockdown 4 measures. Nobody was abiding by that. Nobody was abiding by non-pharmaceutical interventions around the transmission of the virus. The MK soldiers, who are disbanded, by the way, were standing there and basically trying to manage and guard people and orchestrate the entire thing. Some NEC members from the ANC went down to Nkandla to visit, to try and implore him to do the right thing. The ANC in the province, also the leadership went in and said, do the right thing. What really got me disturbed, if not angry, was the fact that every time something happens, everybody's got to run to Mr. Jacob Zuma to prevail on him to do the right thing. And with this court judgment, the idea was that this notion of trying to prevail for him to do the right thing would not have happened. He needed to do the right thing. Even on Wednesday night, when people were speculating whether or not he would go to prison in escort to the correctional services, there was a group of SAP led by a very young woman who was sitting with Mr. Jacob Zuma saying, using the term, Ubaba, this is it. This is what needs to be done. This is where you need to go. And he was trying to get all kinds of assurances out of her that his food would be cooked by somebody who won't want to poison him. All the specters started coming out. All the conspiracy theories started coming out. I can't go to jail. I'm 79 years old. I could pick up COVID in jail. I could get really sick. Somebody could poison me. Somebody needs to cook my food. All of these things became part of that theatrical space that we saw. But I do, for the biggest part, until Wednesday last week, and even today, I do believe that we enabled our institutions to do the right thing. We kept to the rule of law. We ensured our constitution prevailed, and we made sure that our constitutional justices also prevailed. Now, what we're seeing in terms of the protest, free Zuma or don't take Zuma to prison, and the looting, I think what started off as a free Zuma campaign or protest actually morphed into complete criminality. It's looting. People that are sitting in that insert that you're showing now, that are basically walking around and carrying TVs and bags and radios and ovens and whatever they can carry outside of the stores, those people are not there, in my opinion, to basically talk about Jacob Zuma and he needs to be freed. I think there's 2 or 3 elements here that are at play. People who are genuinely looting and looting the shops. Those that are essentially using it as a basis to say, I'm doing this in the name of Jacob Zuma because he needs to be free. And then there's a third element here, in my opinion, who are instigating this. And it's not just looting shops anymore, Suleiman. They now want to loot homes. They want to get into homes of people of Indian descent.
I think I don't mean to just hold your train of thought there. We'll come back to you. We're going on a break. We'll come back. We'll stretch that so that we can actually look at that angle and see how much we can understand of the categories of persons who are up there on the street. And Matodzi will help us look at the Constitution and, of course, what a lot of lawyers, especially in Nigeria, is saying about South Africa, that South Africa is actually showing what they call a true separation of powers, knowing full well that Jacob Zuma is still a member of South Africa's ruling party. That's when we return. Join us again. Was our home run here on VSA, and we're looking at former President Jacob Zuma's travails. By the way, right about now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is addressing South Africa about the protest. But in the course of the program, we should be able to bring you more update on that as we round off. Well, maybe quickly we can just get a snippet of what the president is saying and come back to Matodzi and Sanusha. President Ramaphosa.
There are shops and businesses that have been destroyed and burnt down, and they're also counting their cost to the safety and security of themselves as South Africans. Many more South Africans are feeling anxious and afraid tonight. Parts of the country are reeling from days and nights of public violence, destruction of property, and looting of the sort rarely seen before in the history of our democracy. Lokhu okwenzekayo manje besingakakuboni. Democracy alone. It started with the bench at Moy River in KwaZulu-Natal this past Saturday, and was followed by blockades of roads in the northern parts of the province and the looting of shops in eThekwini and Pietermaritzburg. For the past 2 days, Gauteng has experienced the blocking of roads, looting of shops, damage to property, and burning of trucks. Thanks to the work of our law enforcement agencies, 166 suspects have been arrested in KwaZulu-Natal, and 323 suspects have been arrested in Gauteng in relation to these incidents. Nevertheless, violence is continuing in many parts of these two provinces and may be spilling over to other provinces. Some have characterized these actions as a form of political protest. This violence may indeed have its roots in the pronouncements and activities of individuals with a political purpose and in expressions of frustration and anger. At the beginning of this unrest, there may have been some people who sought to agitate for violence and disorder along ethnic lines. We know that the majority of our people have, out of principle, refused to be mobilized along these ethnic lines. However, what we are witnessing now are opportunistic acts of criminality with groups of people instigating chaos merely as a cover for looting and theft. There is no grievance nor any political cause that can justify the violence and the destruction that we have seen in parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Our constitution guarantees to organize, to engage in free expression and free association. Our constitution is very clear on these. It gives every person an equal right to protection before the law and confers on every person a responsibility to respect and uphold the rights of others. Our Constitution is the foundation of the rule of law in our country. And this is a right that was fought for by many in our country, and many people laid down their lives so that we can have this right. It is this rule of law that guards against the abuse of power, that protects the poor and the vulnerable. It is this rule of law that enables our society to function and our economy to develop in the interests of the people of South Africa. The victims of the violence that is unfolding now, the victims being the workers, owners, the parents and families who lost their lives, have done nothing wrong whatsoever. Although these may be opportunistic acts of looting driven by hardship and poverty.
Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa there addressing South Africans, and a lot of Africans watching live saying that unfortunate development in South Africa as people trooped out onto the street. He's also said that the law enforcement agents, as we've highlighted here on the show, taking action, and some people have been arrested, but the numbers are rising and people are not letting off. Matodzi, quickly here, listening to President Ramaphosa in trying to actually put this in perspective. He did something that, more like a surprise, but politically speaking, I think some would say that was a fine one. He refused to mention names. He said, well, some, people, based on their political influence, perhaps this protest isn't actually far from what we're seeing. But let's come back to looking at what we said we were going to talk about after that break. And, we have to talk about the African judicial system. In Europe, America, and a lot of other people, they look towards Africa. But it would seem as if now South Africa judicial system seem to be stronger. As a legal, practitioner. What more can you say about Africa's judicial system? How can the continent, so speaking now, make its judicial system stronger and a working one?
Look, I mean, I think it's commonly where a former president in the circumstances is incarcerated. And I think it's important to remember, I think as Sanusha gave the context, the 700 corruption charges that Jacob Zuma faces that Sanusha mentioned earlier are back. He's actually in court. I think he will be back in court in the next 2 weeks or so. Now, that's a more serious, those are more serious charges. And I think what has happened now, what that says is, if he were to, and I think he realizes that now, that if he were to be found guilty of say, as you say, from a human point of view, it's regrettable. An old man in a cold cell in winter, it's not anyone's idea of something that one would want to see. But if we look at it objectively, the judicial system is working. We didn't maybe anticipate the consequences of the violence that is erupted, but I think from where we sit, it will go down as a precedent that this system works. And these are decisions of the highest court in the land. So in accordance with our legal system, if a decision is taken at that level, the lower courts, any other courts below, need to comply. There's no other way of unraveling what they've actually done. So it has significant impact, in the legal system. And I imagine it will have a ripple effect, going up in the continent to see that it can actually be done.
Well, no doubt the effect is spreading. You should hear the conversation in a lot of places, Nigeria inclusive, and I'm excited about this. Now Sanusha, it's not about the conviction. It's about even, what we have seen concerning Jacob Zuma. Now, for a lot of people, they're asking, how can this particular conviction of President Zuma mean? What does it mean to other countries on the continent whose past leaders might have a slew of atrocities, especially against their names?
Let me put it into context, Raman. This conviction is really about a technical issue. It's a technical issue that Mr. Jacob Zuma had spurred the courts, refused to appear before the Zondo Commission. When asked to do so by the courts and through a summons, went back and said, no, I won't do it, and left the court again. And so this is a contempt of order court. He was not there. He was asked to be there. He refused to do so. And this is the judgment you're now hearing, and the judgment that his lawyers are beginning to ask for in terms of a rescission application is based on the fact that he never appeared before the Zondo Commission. It has nothing to do with his corruption trial. It has nothing to do with the 783 other corruption trials that are coming, and it has nothing to do with the trial that's going to come on the 19th of June regarding the arms deal. This is a plain and simple matter of a man who chose not to appear before court, even being asked to do so. He still decided not to. Some people are arguing that because it's such a negligible action, should the courts have given him 15 months in that contempt of court decision, because that means that he's taking on quite a hectic punitive action, and that punitive action sets a precedence in case law for others to come in and say, well, we can do the same, and Mr. Zuma got 15 months, so there's a precedent. So should it have been 30-day suspension with some kind of financial remuneration? But I think the real issue here is if Mr. Zuma has to get to court, if he is found guilty of the corruption charges, then I think we're sitting in a different dynamic around this judicial system. And I think that's where public opinion across Africa, across Nigeria, and other parts of the world are going to be arguing that this is the first time in our democratic state after 1994 that we are dealing with this dilemma of a former head of state who essentially now is sitting in the escort correction facility because he did not do what was a very simple thing to do. This comes back to the question of lawyers. Did the lawyers advise him appropriately? This comes back to the question of, did he listen to his lawyers? Was he much more about, I am Jacob Zuma, so even if I walk out of the Zondo Commission, even if I flip them off, it doesn't matter because I'm Jacob Zuma and nobody does this to me. Well, somebody did it to you, and that was the Constitutional Court. Now, all of that has come to the point to say his spin doctors are spinning it so badly that some of it can't even stay within the spinning wheel. Because at the end of the day, they are talking about trial without detention without trial. It was never a trial. It was an order. You go and appear before the court. If you don't appear before the court, there's a contempt. Every single one of us, you, Suleiman, me, Matodzi, every one of us, if we don't go to the court, there's a contempt. And I think that's what's really sad here is that this whole thing has got spun into a situation where it has been manipulated to create different interpretations of what is a very simple thing. I think if the rest of the continent is looking to us to say we're upholding the rule of law, we're upholding the judicial system, well, what's going to be very important is the Constitutional Court, when they make their decision after hearing arguments today, will they rescind the application? Will they reduce the jail time? Or will they become even more emboldened and more perhaps angry to say, Mr. Jacob Zuma, we gave you X amount of time. You did not choose to come here. We may even keep it at 2. We may keep it at 15 months, or we may decide to give you even a higher sentence. Nobody knows.
Let's see if Matodzi will help us here. Will Zuma, appearing in front of the Commission of Inquiry now make any difference?
Well, I think that the question was actually raised during the hearing today. I think one of the judges asked the Commission's lawyer to say, and this has looked in all our applications in court, we had said if he changes his mind, we can make arrangements. The Commission is almost ended. Fortunately, they've had an extension. But what they kept harping on about was he has written a 21-page letter where he told everybody who cared to listen that he will not attend the commission for as long as Justice Zondo remains the chairperson. So it's of course, I mean, the whole intention all along was for him to come and account for what happened under his watch while he was in office. My sense is that horse has bolted. It's been overtaken by events. The recession, it's a long shot. I think the Constitutional Court will be hard pressed to change it, because what has happened here is that people talk about the majority and the minority decision, and what doesn't get spoken often about is that actually both the minorities and the majority have actually agreed that he was in contempt. Where they differed was the extent of the sentence and what should happen to him. So we know that all the justices agree that he was in contempt of court. If anything, the question is, what was the appropriate sanction? And maybe it can come to what Sanusha is talking about. Maybe they can reconsider it. But given the arguments that I have today, the Commission's lawyer makes a compelling argument that technically he has not presented a case for rescission. He's sneaking in an appeal at the back door, and if the court does that, it will really bring itself into disrepute.
Let me bring in Sanusha here. Now we're winding down quickly here. I try not to bring Matodzi into trying to analyze this. So we always try as much as possible to let him do the legal thing for us. We've seen President Cyril Ramaphosa, speak to the people of South Africa. You think that is enough? How much more do we expect from the South African government in the approach of the current situation at hand? Because it is dire.
Suleiman, I think people are feeling very, very, what's the word? They're feeling very let down. They feel as if President Ramaphosa could have done or could have spoken earlier. He could have actually addressed the situation much earlier and be more decisive. The other issue is the question of leadership and leaders. Our police minister, for example, he wasn't visible in the last 24 hours. I think I only saw him on Saturday. These are individuals that need to be on the ground to be able to try and bring some level of stability and semblance to the situation on the ground. We haven't seen these leaders. We haven't even seen the provincial leadership from KZN where the looting and all this tension is much more palatable. And I think the challenge for us now is how much are these leaders are going to be, firstly, present, but do we believe them? Do we trust them that they got the situation under control? Just to give you a small example, the police on the ground, they were not visible. In fact, those that were visible were so kind of reticent to even go in and try and address the situation where shops and cars and big malls were being looted. And that tells you that they didn't have the capacity. They didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the resources, but they were not able to carry out their public orders policing. The army has come in, but it has come in under Section 201, which means that they have to work with the police. Again, what happened to our capacity of our security forces, our public order policing? Where's the capacity to get them on the ground, deploy them in a way that they should be deployed? And lastly, I want to make the point about our intelligence services. For the longest time, since Monday, there was agitation, not this Monday, the last Monday, there was agitation over the weekend last week that something was going to come. Where was the intelligence to try and pick where things were? And I think this is where our frustration lies. And I hope the president is able to address these issues, because at the moment I can tell you with certainty from communities and friends and families who are out in those areas where the looting is taking place, communities have decided to do their own community policing. I've family, friends and members who are actually going out and barricading their communities and making sure nobody comes in, and they're doing it on their own, and they're doing it with their own facilities.
Well, I think yes, at this point, I'd like to thank you both for being such nice company, honestly.
If I just want to make one last point about Jacob Zuma.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Whether Jacob Zuma goes to the Zondo Commission is immaterial now, because I don't know whether the Zondo Commission has time for him.
Well, it's a fine place. I'd like to thank both of you, Sanusha Naidoo and Matodzi Ratshimbilani. Many thanks for being such a nice company for really unpacking this for Africans, and hopefully calm will be restored in South Africa soon, and normalcy will prevail in the country, because that country remains a vantage point on the continent and one that leads in many areas, and I dare say so. I think we'll leave our viewers with the broadcast of the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa here on VSA. I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. A few people among us threaten this collective effort on our path to putting in place the reforms and the economic reconstruction that we should have. Our constitutional democracy, consolidate our gain, reject violence and chaos, we can move forward. Building up ahead of us.